Welcome to Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. I'm here with Ann Lipton, as always, a law professor, a very busy law professor at Tulane in New Orleans, who teaches and researches securities and business law. She holds at the legal end of our podcast.
And that's Mike Levin, an activist investor who lives and works in Chicago. He covers the financial side of our podcast.
Yes, though we have a lot more legal stuff than financial stuff to talk about lately. Today, we'd like to spend the show talking about SEC Form D and G, some technical stuff with some very 13D and G, what these are, how they work, and then, of course, some very new and interesting rules that the SEC plans to impose on them.
Yeah, and this is actually part of a larger story of a bunch of changes, both to federal law and apparently soon to Delaware law, that'll significantly change, I think, the balance of power between management and investors. So they'll likely affect different types of investors in different ways, but we'll be devoting a couple of podcasts to explaining and discussing exactly what's going on and what investors and companies might need to know about the changing environment. But we're starting with 13D and 13G.
13D and 13G, which is normally pretty routine stuff. So you've been a busy person, Ann. A lot of writing, a lot of blogging, a lot of questions. There's plenty of stuff that's developed between this and other SEC things and Delaware. So let's plunge into the D and G stuff, if we may. Let's begin at the very beginning. What do we mean? What is not Form 13D and G, but what is Section 13D? I'm guessing of SEC regulation, right?
Actually, statute. It's a statute.
So it's a statute? Okay.
Yeah, the story goes back to, it's an actual law. It passed by Congress.
It's a law that Congress took a stand here, when Congress used to do that.
Yes, when they used to do that. In 1968, when hostile tender offers were like the new big thing. And at that time, these were entirely unregulated, and there was no such thing as a poison pill. That wouldn't be invented for like another 20 years. So corporate boards were sort of like sitting ducks. And a lot of these tender offers were coercive. There was very little information about the acquirer, and they were often structured in two tiers so that the acquirer would pay some figure to anyone who tendered in. But then as soon as they got control of the company with 50%, they'd close the offer, and then they'd use their control to squeeze out everyone else at a lower price, which meant shareholders were sort of stampeded into accepting the tender offer so that they could avoid getting stuck in the squeeze out at the back end. Yes. So Congress decided to address this with the Williams Act, and the act put a whole new series of regulations on tender offers. But the relevant one here was Section 13D, and it was just a disclosure requirement. If anyone gets 5% of a company's shares, originally it was 10%, but they lowered it almost immediately. If anyone gets 5% of a company's shares, they have to disclose their position. And the theory was that that would serve as an early warning signal to boards and shareholders that there was a shark in the water. So under today's rules, once you cross that 5% threshold, you have 5 days to file a form disclosing that you're there and disclosing your plans for the stock. And if anything changes, if you increase or decrease your position by more than 1%, or if any of your plans change, then you have 2 days to file a new form with the updated information, including the last 60 days worth of trades in the stock. So it's actually a rather detailed form that you have to file. So
Section 13D begat Form 13D, which I
Schedule
have
13D,
plenty of. Schedule 13D, which I do plenty of, or I've done my share of. Which is a medium to large hassle.
Yes.
In terms of its extensive detail, in terms of its timing, the deadlines for filing this just got updated about a year or so ago. Mm-hmm. So you now have less time to file your updates.
Yeah, 5 days and 2 days, and it used to be 10 days.
And activists routinely accept this, and sometimes even use it to their advantage. Sometimes you can use a D to like convey stuff that you'd like to kind of send out in a certain way. But again, mostly it's viewed as some sort of regulatory red tape. So there it is. So you got to file this D when you cross 5%, and you got to do all these disclosures. So why do BlackRock and let's talk. How does this affect the big indexers these days?
Well, because the concern is of 13D is about someone getting control of a company. The SEC defines ownership, like crossing the 5% threshold ownership, to include anyone who has the power to dispose of shares, meaning to buy and sell them, and anyone who has voting control of the shares, even if they don't actually have title, like the sponsor of a mutual fund who makes voting decisions and purchase decisions on behalf of a fund. So also 13D has this concept of groups. So the fear at the time was investors would get cute and kind of divide their holdings among different vehicles, or two investors
to evade the 5%.
Exactly. Or two investors would work together, each with holdings just before the 5%. So under the rules, if you coordinate your activity, even if you're two different investors, you're grouped for the purposes of counting to 5%, which means the largest asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, when you include all of the hundreds of funds they control, each of them easily count as owners of more than 5% of thousands of companies. Now, technically, they don't own the stock. The mutual funds own the stock. But they have control over how the shares are voted. And for the most part, each family coordinates voting, so they're all grouped together. And it's not just the funds. Any clients that they have their own brokerage accounts, like a Fidelity brokerage account, for example, if Fidelity has discretionary power to vote those shares or discretionary power to buy and sell for that
for like
account,
separately managed accounts.
Exactly. Then Fidelity is an owner of those accounts, and those will get lumped together. Now, if these mutual funds had to file a new form every time their holdings increased or decreased by 1%
or every time they
all the
traded,
funds, exactly, and then disclose all the trades in the past 60 days, I mean, that's all they'd never do. They'd never do anything else. They'd be disclosing every time someone bought or sold mutual fund shares because the fund has to buy.
So they'd be filing multiple 13Ds like every
constantly.
Week.
Plus, they'd be revealing client confidential information, like for the separate accounts. So it's just not feasible. So the statute and SEC rules have an exception. If you're a passive holder, if you obtain your shares just for investment without planning to influence the company, you get a simplified reporting system. You only have to update your forms every quarter. You don't have to list all your past trades. And that passive form, instead of being a Schedule 13D, is called a 13G. And by the way, when I say this, I have to say I'm like cribbing the research that was done by a guy named John Morley, who wrote an article you'll love. It's called Too Big to Be Activist, where he wrote about how these mutual funds really need to file on Schedule 13D. So it's crucial that they be deemed passive so that they don't have to file a 13D.
All right. So the default is D.
Yeah.
And you can sort of take advantage of this exception, which I think is in the statute.
Yeah. It's in the statute, yes.
That says, okay, and if you have no intention of influencing or controlling or doing, and there's probably some good verbiage there that we should debate at some point, or we will, then you benefit from G, which is the much looser disclosure requirement. Okay.
Exactly.
So it seems like this whole thing turns on what we mean by active and passive. Is that
that's the critical issue. What is passive? Because what
do we mean?
It's changing. So the idea is that back in the 2000s-ish, mutual funds were really, really passive. Like they barely voted, or they always voted with management, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the SEC started criticizing them. The SEC's view was that mutual fund companies are fiduciaries to their clients, and they have an obligation to vote their shares in their clients' best interest. So in 2003, they created this rule. Mutual fund companies are required to develop proxy voting policies and publicly disclose those policies. So now every mutual fund company has a big list of their proxy voting policies. They update them every year. They're big news. Like, so BlackRock's voting policies say
there's stewardship
guidelines. They rather have companies have single class boards. They have views on executive comp. And they say if companies adopt plans they don't like, they may choose to vote against the responsible directors. So, and this is all because the SEC was encouraging them to get involved with corporate stewardship. So they built out a whole governance practice where they periodically meet with corporate management.
All these big stewardship teams.
Exactly. But none of that, all of that was, prodded essentially by the regulators, SEC and also the Department of Labor, because they handle retirement.
This is because the votes are viewed as an asset that are viewed as deserving of fiduciary duty, fiduciary responsibility. Okay.
Exactly. So that raised the question, does all of that, which I must emphasize they're required to do, does that make them active holders? And the SEC said no, it doesn't. And it did that through something called a CD&I.
Right. So, what does that stand for?
That stands for it stands for compliance and disclosure interpretation. So the idea is that Sometimes the SEC acts by formally putting out a binding rule, and that goes through a whole public process. It's approved by the commission. It takes forever. But a lot of the time, instead of putting out a formal rule, it just offers guidance, like how it at the staff level, not even the head commission people, think about the interpretation of the rules. But even though it's staff and it's not binding, I mean, the staff isn't going to go rogue. They're obviously taking their signals from the commission. And in 2016, it put out a CD&I that said, if you're just concerned about corporate social responsibility or ESG or executive comp, and you generally across the board dislike takeover defenses, that doesn't make you an active holder. You can still file as passive. So that was fine. The mutual fund companies can continue as they always did until February 11th. Now,
last week.
Yes, exactly. So under the Trump administration, the SEC went in and changed its guidance to say that if you tell companies you want these kinds of governance changes, ESG stuff, but also remove a staggered board, change the executive comp, and if you say that you'll vote against directors over it, you might be active. And you don't even have to say it explicitly. The guidance says that an implicit vote, a threat to vote against directors counts. So
that was so just to recap for a moment.
Yeah.
So for very many years, all these investors, and again, you have to file a G or a D if you own more than 5%, but having arrangements with other shareholders could push you over that level. And again, activists are very familiar with that principle. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't matter because most of these big funds are going to be over anyway without forming a group. So they were routinely meeting with, talking to, having phone calls and in-person meetings or Zoom meetings with their portfolio companies.
They boast about it. They put it on their website, like how many thousands of engagements they had over a year.
Exactly. We engage routinely.
Yeah.
And that was viewed as, so to speak, passive. And they were allowed to continue to file Gs like routinely, Schedule 13G. And then last week, there was a shift in what the staff would view and in terms of like recommending enforcement actions against company or investors. Yeah. And these enforcement actions were for bad disclosure. Look,
for not
we think
filing.
You should have been filing a D instead of a G. And so all the stuff you've been doing can be interpreted to be active.
Exactly.
Okay. Why do we think we decided to do this?
Well, I mean, so there right now the SEC is not working with the full 5 commissioners because some Democrats resigned. They haven't appointed the new commissioner. So the acting commissioner now is Mark Uyeda, and he's actually given speeches about this. He's been very transparent. His view is that once upon a time, all director voting was under a plurality standard, so that even if they didn't get a majority of votes cast, as long as there wasn't an active proxy contest, you could be sure they'd be seated. In that context, if you're a big mutual fund and you say, well, I won't vote for you unless you get rid of your poison pill, it wouldn't matter. They'd still get seated.
Right. So there was no like practical impact.
Exactly.
Somebody. Okay.
And the previous guidance, that was actually written in 2016, but it was based on older guidance, that came from this plurality standard. But Commissioner Uyeda's view is that today so many companies have majority vote standards for directors. See, and I say, exactly, you're already looking skeptical. So but his view is that because so many companies have majority vote standards, that if a big shareholder like BlackRock says, well, I won't vote for this guy, the head of your comp, if you don't change your executive comp policies, that really makes a difference and that makes you active. So
it makes the vote more material because of the shift. And it's worth saying, Commissioner Uyeda is correct. Most of the S&P 500 and a lot, not as many other like the Russell 3000 and so forth, have this majority vote.
Well, they say they do, but they don't.
Well, no,
really.
they absolutely do. It's in the bylaws.
No, it's in the bylaws, but a lot of don't. But don't a lot of them have that majority plus?
It's
where you
well,
it's more like they have majority plus where like you have to offer your resignation and the board may or may not accept it.
Right.
Yeah.
This leads to this whole problem of zombie directors.
Exactly.
So I think his reasoning is on paper accurate, but practically speaking is a little doesn't understand life, but the what happens in real life here. Anyway,
nonetheless,
so go ahead.
that was apparently his view because that's a speech he gave, and lo and behold, now he's the acting commissioner, and the guidance changed. Now, so that large asset managers obviously they cannot risk being forced to file on Schedule 13G. So it was suddenly reported that BlackRock and Vanguard immediately started canceling their meetings in the middle of the proxy season. BlackRock, I guess, started.
Yeah, we just saw something that they resumed. Yeah, right. Okay.
Now, the CD&I, I just want to say that this CD&I, the way it's worded, it's very much about engagement, taking meetings, not this posting voting guidelines. So maybe the guidelines themselves are okay, but I don't know how long that lasts because remember, the CD&I says implicit threats are bad, and I don't know what's more of an implicit threat than putting up a voting guideline that says, if you don't do it this way, then we may vote against you. Like, what else? It seems pretty explicit to me, actually. So anyway, the last thing I'll say, though, like before we get to the second segment, I just want to say about this. When we talk about corporate law in the academic space, when academics talk about it, they call it private ordering. They say this is really just about private arrangements between investors and managers. The whole field of corporate law is put into the category of private law. And to me, that's like ludicrous. There's nothing private about this. This is the state very specifically and deliberately imposing governance obligations on investors in the 2000s and then using its ability to bury those investors in paperwork to suddenly take away those governance obligations and actually take them out of the governance business overnight. So this is not private ordering. This is state ordering.
Let me ask one quick question, then we can take a break. We've talked before about who the SEC is really trying, whose interest the SEC is trying to defend. And I always think, when I ever think about, changes in regs or enforcement or something, the SEC, its primary, not exclusive, but its primary goal is defend investors, shareholders, not necessarily orphans, widows and orphans or mom and pop, but defend investors.
Right.
Okay, they're not as interested in trying to make, help companies out and so forth. Do you think investors were demanding more information, demanding that these 5% holders disclose more about what they were doing?
Well, I don't think they need details of whether BlackRock, how many people traded in and out of a BlackRock fund on the daily. Like that does not sound like, I understand why they wanted to know the activist trades, but wanting to know how many people went in and out of a BlackRock fund every for the past 60 days. I mean, that just seems like ludicrous.
So it doesn't seem like the shareholders overall, sort of broadly drawn.
I can't see why that would possibly
We're looking
be of
for
any
more
use.
13D disclosure about this activity.
Exactly.
So there's probably something else going on, and we can probably talk about that. Let's take a quick break and then talk about that, and return in a moment to look at the impact of some of these changes on activists and shareholders and companies here at Shareholder Primacy.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFloatAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFloatAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at FreeFloatAnalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Ann Lipton here with Mike Levin. So now we have talked about what just happened in the change with 13D and 13G. So what does it all mean? What does it all mean?
That's a great question. How will people react?
Yeah. So how many
like activists like me and so forth.
Exactly. So how many 13Gs are filed usually?
Well, that's actually interesting. We were kind of wondering about that. Matt Moscardi at Free Float helped us with some data. It's not entirely, easy to kind of get your arms around. I mean, you could probably get some sort of count, but he counted using the Free Float data at least 42,000 Form Schedule 13Gs were filed in calendar year 2024.
Okay.
And that's a lot. Again, now some of those, a bunch of those, they're not from funds that have,
there are other kinds of
stewardship teams.
Too.
There's plenty of other investors that just got a 5% and they're just kind of holding it.
Yeah.
But there's a good well, importantly, the big three that we call it, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they file thousands of 13Gs. BlackRock filed 3,418 13G schedules in 2024. Vanguard, even more, 3,739. State Street, you need to pick up your game. You only found 2,664. So and almost all of them, under what we've talked about, would be susceptible to needing to be converted to a
given the
Form
change.
D.
Yeah. Yeah, and every time 1% change every 2
that
days.
Ain't and when you got to amend it, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And that ain't
exactly.
Because you gotta state all your investors, your background. You've got to state, there's always Section 4. Or item 4 of the 13D, which is the first thing I read when I look at a 13D, is your intentions and your plans. That ain't happening. Okay, so you could sort of see how this worked, and you mentioned when you were kind of going over some of the basics that BlackRock and Vanguard already announced, hey, we're putting meetings on hold, though evidently BlackRock said we're taking off the hold. But the news, there's like one little news account that they said every meeting starts with this announcement, this is passive.
Exactly. So, I don't know what's the point, especially what are they going to do? They're not trading, so they're not getting information to trade on, even if they could, which would be a whole separate issue.
They're trying to push it.
And they can't push anyone to, and apparently they're not allowed to push anyone to do anything differently. So what?
So it's very unclear. And BlackRock, I'm guessing, got some advice and said got some outside counsel write them a letter that said, okay, if you announce this is kind of like when you go to an industry meeting and we say we're not going to talk about any kind of antitrust stuff.
Right.
It doesn't change. There could be some substance there. So declaring that it's passive doesn't necessarily make it passive, and that's a point I'm going to return to.
Okay.
I'd like to return to in a minute. So let's talk a little bit about
So how is this going to affect
the
companies?
different constituent companies are fine with this. Companies do not want these meetings, except in ways I'm going to talk about in a minute. Companies do not relish having to talk to, well, really any shareholder about anything, but they do not, want to start talking to the stewardship departments of their big investors about, and getting yelled at about how your staggered board is not good, or about how we need more diversity or whatever.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I
don't think you're allowed to talk about diversity anymore. It's illegal.
Right. Well, correct. But this is kind of emblematic about who this was aimed at. Is not only my guess, but sort of the consensus. This was aimed at the big, not just the big 3, but the big 10 or 20 shareholders or investors that have big stewardship departments that were kind of, to use a word, kind of bothering or pestering a lot of big companies about this stuff.
Yeah.
For reasons you'll see, these regs aren't really going to affect many other people in these ways. And let's talk for a minute about those big shareholders.
Okay.
I kind of think, and this is, just one person's opinion, I think those big indexers are secretly kind of okay with this for now.
I actually suspect you're right. But why don't you tell me?
Well, because look, the stewardship teams aren't. They love this stuff.
Well, they were hired to do this.
This is what they do. This is their job. And there's got plenty of other jobs they can do. Okay, there's lots of other votes they have to take. There's lots of other things they have to research because, again, there's fiduciary duties that these investors have to uphold. Okay, but I think that, just in the same way that the big indexers were trying to promote pass-through voting.
Yeah.
To try to get out of this business.
They wanted to get out of this business. Exactly. They wanted the heat up.
Exactly. So I think that they were kind of okay with this.
Yeah, and it's more than that. I mean, the theory was always that, remember, they built these practices out because the SEC made them, because the Department of Labor made them. There's this is a huge debate in academic circles, whether there's any even financial incentive for them to do this, or if they're just doing this because they have to for regulatory purposes.
Exactly.
So if they don't have to do it for regulatory purposes, I'm not sure how much they're crying.
Right, correct. Now let's talk about activists, and there's two kinds in my world. There's either activists like me who are more financial, and then ESG activists that are promoting issues. Now, activists, financial activists, whatever, hedge funds don't care. This is not going to affect them. We file 13Ds all the time. We're very used to disclosing all sorts of weird stuff on 13D, or writing item 4 in a way that's really kind of vague.
That's really cagey.
So
Actually, talk to my class about it.
There's ways to write item 4 that don't disclose anything. Or we don't own 5%, and we're not going to be in a group with any. We're very careful when it comes to group formation rules. So if either we're filing Gs, and then we're ready to flip it into a D when we start moving on our project, or we're not in that filing position at all, and we're really cognizant of when we get above 13 above 5%. Now, the big funds that this was aimed at, they don't have that luxury because they're allocating based on a model. They're they have a huge algorithm that tells them how much of a company they should own. And if that algorithm tells you need to own 8% of some company, that's what they got to do.
Right.
So, so activists like that don't really care. ESG activists that aren't the big indexers that are actively promoting proposals or trying to engage and so forth, they probably don't care either because they're not getting close to 5%.
Well, they don't care about the filing.
Right. Okay, well, right. Oh, wait a second.
But they might care
because they might care because they're going to lose a little bit of the juice that the big indexers give them.
Yeah.
But in terms of their filing,
their filing habits now.
Yeah, this isn't going to affect them. So this is really targeted at those really big investors, and that gets to be a really interesting area. Okay, because there are some sort of potential second or third order impacts here.
Okay.
That very few people have started to think about. Okay, so for example, it could start to affect, proxy contests. Okay, because if you're the company and you've got some schmo like me who's trying to run candidates at your company, okay, and you want to reach out and start to engage with the big shareholders, that may put a chill on that engagement. They may decide that taking a meeting with you and expressing their views about this proxy contest could put them in 13D filing.
Yeah, I mean,
position.
The SEC is trying to give guidance that shareholders can talk to each other without it counting as putting them in the 13G, but they're already
shareholders can talk to each other as much as they want.
But
this is whether
can
companies can talk to the big shareholder. And look, those big indexers are really risk averse in this area in terms of regulatory.
Oh, no, absolutely.
They just want to run their model. They just want to figure out how they can beat Vanguard on fees, and then do enough stewardship that they're going to keep people happy.
Right.
Okay. And if they're happy to and eager to vote properly, but in terms of how companies in particular, because again, I can call any shareholder I want. Without forming a group, if I'm just soliciting their proxy,
right?
Okay, I can have whatever discussions I want. And if the company is kind of soliciting their proxy, maybe it can be viewed as proxy solicitation and not, getting into trying to influence. But that's going to be an area that I think these indexers, at least for the time being, are going to shy away from.
Yeah, I mean, I can see especially if the investor thinks something like, well, I would vote for the company if I had some kind of assurance that blank, 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 but I can't get that insurance because I can't tell them that.
Exactly. And that gets to another interesting aspect of this is how enforcement's going to work. Now, it's worth noting that the enforcement problem, or what you're trying to enforce, is a disclosure issue. So the problem with bad disclosure is just better disclosure. So the worst that's going to happen to some of these companies is they got to flip from a G to a D.
But they can't.
So well, wait. I mean, they may not want to, but there's not like huge fines or something. I mean, it'd be really unusual for that to happen, or maybe there are. I don't know.
Yeah, no, the fines haven't been. Well, actually, that's a whole separate issue. But I wonder because they're regulated as investment advisors. I imagine.
Oh yes,
the SEC could
fine. Okay, yeah. They may come down on them hard. But in the past, in the
past, it's usually been fines, except for when they came after Elon Musk, where they came up with a whole separate penalty.
Okay, so but if there's some sort of a conversation that takes place between an investor and a company, because this is clearly the investor was trying to influence things in ways that, right, is the company going to report that?
How does the SEC know?
How is the SEC going to learn? Is the company going to report it anonymously? Are they going to say, I had this discussion with a big filer and they're going to vote against us? So I'm going to report them because they should have. I mean, that's going to really put a. First, it's going to you got to wonder how they're going to enforce this if that's what's going to happen.
Right.
Or second, you think things are going to get cold now, just because shareholders or big indexers are going to want to not going to want to avoid the situation. Imagine when they start thinking ahead to say, okay, if I start saying this, is this company going to report? I'm really not going to have this kind of discussion. So there's like I was talking about second and third order. This could really, the threat of enforcement coming only from the company. Who else is going to report it?
Yeah.
No other shareholders are going to know whether what kind of conversations took place. So this is really going to have an impact. I could potentially really have an impact on the discussions between companies and their big shareholders.
Wow.
And I'm not sure that's what the SEC sort of intended here, but maybe they did. I don't know. Okay. There's another, impact here that those big shareholders, they've invested a lot in stewardship. They've thought a lot about it. Again, it's not as important as performance, but it's not unimportant. Okay, they take seriously their fiduciary duty to vote and so forth. Most do. Again, there's probably some funds that just don't care and are happy for this. But there's most of the big ones have, this kind of commitment to that. They may start to be a lot more careful in how they express stuff. So there's another chilling effect there too. Right, so rather than being out there with all your policies and saying this is
but
how
they have
vote
to put their
so
I mean, this is where they're in a bind because they are legally required to disclose their voting policies.
Right. So there's probably going to be a shift here in what we see publicly.
Right.
From what these big investors are kind of willing to do, which is interesting because there's a lot of tea leaf reading that goes on among proxy solicitors and other activists and so forth. What do we think BlackRock will do? What do we think Vanguard will do in this particular instance? There's a huge amount of reliance placed on not just past votes at a company or something, but on what their public statements are.
Right.
And if those public statements are going to possibly be curtailed or a little more careful, it's going to be a lot harder for activists, whether you're an ESG proponent or a guy like me, in trying to predict or understand at least the direction they might go with a company. So their sentiment about a company is going to be a lot harder to read, at least for now. Okay. And again, that was not also necessarily what was going on here. The point I was kind of hinting at a little while ago was that, look, shareholders weren't looking for this. Not really.
No, this is to get them to stop. This is to control their behavior.
Right, exactly. This is because companies have been complaining for years.
Yeah.
about having to respond to all this, and Commissioner Ueda, who you and I've met, and he's a good guy generally. Had been saying, look, we need to kind of do something about this, and you do this, and there could be some other, as we said, second, third order effects that may have a consequence that these companies may have not kind of anticipated. So it's a little bit of, be careful what you wish for, I suppose. Yeah. So, anyway, again, this is not going to have an impact on proposals. There's a whole other bit of the SEC rulemaking that we need to, or another.
There's been a lot of changes that will be.
We will talk about those in future shows or imminently future shows.
Yeah.
But this whole change in 13DG is has a lot of potential unexpected impacts.
Exactly.
That we're going to have to kind of work through, and it's even more interesting because it's happening right in the middle of proxy season
exactly.
These meetings.
It's right where they're all getting.
There's a bunch of proposals that are making it onto company annual meeting agendas, and so this really, it was funny because we were kind of. In terms of civic affairs, there's lots of stuff going on in Washington, and I was kind of saying, hey, there's not a whole lot happening in the investing in activist world. And then last week happened, and then here we go.
Here we go.
So, I don't know. There's some interesting impacts there between big indexers, companies, other activists, ESG funds, and so it's a lot to kind of monitor. But it's worth saying it's pretty early. It's only a week or two.
Yeah. We don't. Yeah. So, we'll see how it unfolds.
We'll see how it unfolds. So I think that's enough on this one. Though there's more to talk about. Related to more SEC stuff to Delaware, and we'll spend the next few shows, at least the next couple shows, kind of trying to take all this apart and give people some insights. Does that make sense?
That is definitely a good plan.
All right. Let's wrap this up then. So this is Shareholder Primacy, hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin. I'm an independent activist investor and advisor to investors about their activist situations. Ann is the Michael M. Fleischman Professor in Business Law and Entrepreneurship at Tulane Law School and an affiliate of Tulane's Murphy Institute. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com and Ann at law.tulane.edu. As always, our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Float Media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk about this stuff again soon.